Hi, my name is Nisa Kors, and I'm going to be discussing the article Shakespeare in the Bush by Laura Bohannon and how it illustrates the powerful role of worldview in shaping cultural interpretation and communication. To start off, Shakespeare in the Bush is about anthropologist Laura Bohannon's travels to West Africa and attempts to share the story of Hamlet with members of the Tiv community. She initially believes that Shakespeare's themes are universal and will be understood across cultures. However, as she narrates the story, the Tiv elders reinterpret major plot points through their own cultural lenses. The challenge uh, they challenge her understanding of ghosts, marriage customs, madness, and revenge, offering explanations consistent with the Tiv traditions and beliefs. By the end of the exchange, Laura realizes that not even work considered a cornerstone of Western literature is interpreted universally, but rather through culturally specific assumptions. The article clearly illustrates how worldview impacts interpretation. A worldview is the framework of beliefs, values, and assumptions through which people interpret reality. The Tiv listeners interpret Hamlet according to their own social norms, spiritual beliefs, and kinship structures. For example, when Hamlet's father's ghost appears, the Tiv reject the idea of a wandering spirit and instead explain it as an omen or a trick. Similar to this, when they see Gertrude's quick remarriage, they don't see Gertrude's quick remarriage as not as morally questionable, but as a socially appropriate and necessary within their cultural system. What Laura considered obvious elements of betrayal and tragedy were filtered through a completely different interpretive grid. This demonstrates that meaning is not inherent in a story, it is constructed through worldview. Let's see here. The next point is on anthrocentric biases. The anthrocentric bias in the article is Laura's initial assumption that Shakespeare represents universal human truths as transcended culture. Her worldview led her to believe that Hamlet would naturally resonate in the same way with the Tiv as it does with Western societies. This reflects anthropocentrism, the belief that one's cultural perspective is the standard or default. Throughout the interaction, she is repeatedly surprised and even frustrated when the Tiv reinterpret key events. Her expectations of universality reveals how deeply her own worldview shapes her perception of what is logical or correct. The story challenges the notion that one's cultural values are normal or best by demonstrating how easily common sense collapses outside of one's cultural environment. What seems morally clear within one society may seem confusing or misguided in another. The Tiv elders confidently correct Laura's interpretation of her own story, just as she initially assumes authority over its meaning. This mutual confidence reveals that that every culture operates within its own internally coherent logic. Um, considering a norm within my own culture, individualism stands out. In Western contexts, independence and personal autonomy are highly valued. Choosing one's own career path, living separately from extended family, prioritizing people's goals are often celebrated. However, an outsider from a collectivist culture might perceive this emphasis on independence as selfish, isolating, or even disrespectful to family obligations. Just as Laura misunderstood the Tiv's assumptions about kinship and marriage, outsiders might misunderstand the moral reasoning behind Western individualism because their own worldview prioritizes communal interdependence instead. Best practice for communication across cultures is to approach differences with humility and curiosity rather than assumptions of universality. Laura's experience shows that assuming shared meaning leads to misunderstanding. Instead, effective intercultural communication requires asking clarifying questions and recognizing that others interpret events through different frameworks. For example, when the Tivs interpret the ghost in Hamlet, a more logical approach to a more logical approach would involve exploring why spiritual beliefs differ rather than defending one interpretation is correct. Having cultural humility allows space for mutual learning rather than competition over whose meaning is superior. In my own experience, I've observed misunderstanding between coworkers over different cultural backgrounds regarding their direct communications. Regarding direct communications. Communication. So a person who values straightforward feedback saw this as effective and honest, while someone else in the same who experienced the same directness saw this as rude and disrespectful. Neither intended harm, but worldviews shaped their perception of what constitutes politeness. This mirrors the article's example of Gertrude's remarriage. Both Laura saw this as morally troubling. While Laura saw this as morally troubling, Tiv saw it as socially responsible. In both cases, actions were interpreted not by intentions alone, but by casual expectations. In conclusion, the most significant lesson I gained from Shakespeare in the Bush is that worldview profoundly shapes perception, meaning, and communication. No story, behavior, or event is interpreted in a vacuum. Recognizing this reality challenges anthropocentrism and invites greater humility in intercultural interactions. The article reminds us that understanding across cultures does not come from assuming sameness, but from engaging differences with openness, respect, and willingness to question our own assumptions. I apologize for the little man in there at the end, but thank you for listening to my take on this article.